Welcome back, everybody. Or for those of you who weren't able to attend before, welcome. I should explain that it's my perverse habit to always play music before my lectures. I do this at Harvard with my students, usually when they're just wandering in the room. The music was rather quiet. If you couldn't hear it, it was Adorno's own string quartet from 1921. Very good. Silence your phones, please. So before I begin, just some words of thanks. First, I want to thank all of you for bearing with me on these rather long lectures over 3 evenings. I'm really grateful to you for attending, and also I'm extraordinarily grateful for all the comments I've received. I'm quite sincere when I say that for me, all academic work is preparatory. There's no such thing as a final argument. There's no such thing as an incorrigible argument. And I'm experimenting here with some thoughts that I'll no doubt revise over the coming months. Before I begin this third and final lecture, I also want to express my gratitude once again to Axel Honneth and his colleagues and staff at the Institut für Sozialforschung and to the Surkamp Verlag for extending to me this wonderful and unexpected invitation. I do fear, honestly, it's undeserved. And I'm especially aware of a great many colleagues whose contributions to understanding Adorno's legacy would perhaps better merit this honor. I also want to add a political remark. As the grandchild of refugees from fascism, I feel especially cognizant of the resurgent xenophobia that confronts us today, not only in the States, but in Europe as well. The Institute is a rare resource that for nearly 100 years now has kept alive not only the spirit of critique, but also the ideal of a better world in which no one would suffer exclusion. For each migrant who has been turned away from the southern border of the United States, for each child that has been torn from her parents or has even died in detention, and for each refugee from Syria or Africa who has drowned in the Mediterranean, trying to reach Europe's shores, the burden of responsibility must weigh on us all the more. This is a responsibility the Institute has honored, and I know it will continue to honor in the coming years. I sincerely fear that those years will not be easy ones. But I take some small consolation in the existence of special communities of research such as this one. All of us are migrants in a deeper sense. This dislocation, this precarity that we share as human beings is a reminder of the responsibility we all have. So, with that, I want to begin. The history of aesthetics in the 20th century is often told today as a narrative of emancipation. Once the artwork freed itself from the authoritarian constraints of representation, it emerged as an autonomous phenomenon that concerned itself only with the imminent construction of its material in accordance with its own self-prescribed laws. But this liberation wasn't complete. It contented itself with the modernist ideal of an artwork as a monad dissociated from its social surroundings. The bourgeois notion of l'art pour l'art remained caught in the inherited spell of magical and religious ritual that still held the viewer in submission. For the bourgeoisie, the veneration of the artwork was still a solitary act of piety that resisted all social entanglements and devoted itself solely to the artwork in a psychological state of concentration, focus, as a quasi-religious rapture. But this negative theology of art was then exposed as a new kind of unfreedom. In a final gesture of dialectical rebellion, the artwork was supposed to free itself from even this spell of bourgeois modernism by dissolving the aura of aesthetic autonomy. Only then would the masses overcome their passivity and find in art the promise of their own political agency. This argument, of course, has become familiar to all of us through the famous essay on the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, written by Walter Benjamin in the mid-1930s. In the many years since its composition, the essay has assumed a near irresistible authority. With its assault on the traditionalist idol of aesthetic autonomy and its striking affirmation of distraction over concentration as the psychological mode best suited to aesthetic experience, the essay became, for many theorists, an early anticipation of the revolt against modernism that would come to be defined as postmodern. By 1974, when Peter Berger, despite his specific disagreements with Benjamin, criticized the bourgeois concept of aesthetic autonomy in his theory of the avant-garde, it seemed that Benjamin's basic verdict was now secure. Modernism now belonged to the past, to the history of aesthetic tradition, and it was only by freeing the artwork from the modernist spell that the gap between the aesthetic and the practical sphere could at last be overcome. It was among the most heroic, if quixotic, efforts by Adorno that he attempted to contest this narrative in the history of art by defending the modernist cause of aesthetic autonomy. In a March 1936 letter, Adorno offers a remarkable statement of protest against Benjamin's attempt to expose the aura as an archaic trace of the artwork's mythic origins in magical or religious ritual. Adorno does not share Benjamin's unqualified enthusiasm for the dissolution of the aura. What Benjamin celebrates as aesthetic disenchantment misses the fact, Adorno thinks, that mechanical reproducibility does not free the artwork from its social bonds. It only tightens those bonds still further, leaving the artwork wholly exposed to thoroughgoing commodification. Adorno challenges Benjamin's argument on two fronts. On the one hand, he admits that it would be bourgeois romanticism to ascribe the artwork's power to the persistence of traditional categories such as the individual's personality. On the other hand, Adorno warns against the anarchistic romanticism that would place blind trust in the spontaneous powers of the proletariat. These two options, Adorno wrote, are merely the torn halves of an integral freedom. In his Brechtian zeal for an ostensibly communist aesthetics, Benjamin posed what Adorno called a false choice. He opted for the ideal of the artwork as an instrument of political mass mobilization and failed to see how this mobilization betrays what it wants to redeem. The heart of the autonomous work of art does not itself belong to the dimension of myth, Adorno explains. Rather, the artwork's autonomy is intrinsically dialectical. Within itself, the magical is crossed with the sign of freedom. Zeichen der Freiheit. Adorno's debate with Benjamin was to continue long after Benjamin's death. Throughout his writings, and even in the pages of the posthumously published Aesthetic Theory in 1970, Adorno pursued the disagreement with his late friend with such intensity that Benjamin persists as a spectral presence whose claims could never fully be exercised. The explanation may be partly biographical. Since their first encounter in Frankfurt in 1923, Adorno had admired and looked up to the older Benjamin, his senior by 11 years, as a gifted thinker whose interpretive originality served as a model for his own cultural criticism. Adorno's 1933 Habilitationsschrift on Kierkegaard bore such a strong resemblance, not in its subject matter, but in method, to Benjamin's own study of the German Trauerspiel, that Gershom Scholem confided to Benjamin that he saw Adorno's book as an act of sublime plagiarism. That Benjamin himself had his book rejected and was condemned to a life of intellectual wandering has left a bitter memory that has refused to fade, not least because Adorno survived the catastrophe that claimed his friend. On the question of Adorno's negative cathexis with Benjamin, his constant attempts to challenge Benjamin's arguments even while he capitalizes upon the prestige of Benjamin's name, it may not be entirely inappropriate to speak of something like survivor's guilt. Our sense of this cathexis is only enhanced when we recall that Adorno's specific objections to Benjamin's artwork essay likely delayed its publication in the Zeitschrift at a time when the author found himself in considerable financial need. But the biographical background should not deter us from taking seriously the substance of their debate. If art is what Adorno calls the sign of freedom, this is because it is the best analog we have within the bounds of sensuous life for an experience that is set partially free from social constraints. Aesthetic autonomy for Adorno is always only partial, because the artwork cannot actually transcend the social world that makes it possible. But the artwork nonetheless becomes a sign within material conditions of the transcendence from material conditions that it has inherited from religion. In the aesthetic theory, Adorno goes so far as to state without embarrassment that, quote, art is the secularization of transcendence. In this sense, Adorno partly agrees with Benjamin that the artwork in its striving for autonomy still retains the afterglow of the theological power it must outwardly disown. The artwork's ritualistic basis, Benjamin had written, no matter how mediated it may be, is still present even in the most profane form of the worship of beauty. And it remains recognizable as what Benjamin calls secularized ritual. In the bourgeois cult of pure art, it reduces to a negative theology. But here the disagreement between Benjamin and Adorno comes into sharpest relief. Benjamin wants an artwork that would be completely stripped of its aura and liberated from its theological heritage. Adorno disagrees that this afterglow can ever be fully expunged. Benjamin's thesis of auratic decay can easily be abused if it is construed in an undialectical fashion. In the aesthetic theory, Adorno warns that any thoroughgoing disenchantment of art, and Salbewung der Kunst, would achieve only art's de-aestheticization, die Entkunstung der Kunst. Or, as he puts it, aura is not only, as Benjamin claimed, the here and now of the artwork, it is whatever goes beyond its factual givenness, its content. One cannot abolish it and still want art. In this third and final lecture, I wish to focus on the status of the aesthetic in Adorno's thought. And I must begin by emphasizing in the strongest possible terms that the problem of art in Adorno is hardly peripheral, nor does his passion for aesthetics signify his retreat from moral or social considerations. When the unedited text of his aesthetic theory was published posthumously in 1970, sorry, I should say unfinished, of course it was lightly edited, the book met with a cool reception, not least because it extolled a species of high modernism that was already in decline. Especially in the visual arts, the center of gravity had already made a decisive shift in tandem with the changing flow of global capital from Paris and Berlin to New York, where by the 1960s, even the last phase of abstract expressionism, typified by the heroic individualism of Pollock, had ceded its authority to new fashions such as pop art. Two works by Andy Warhol from 1962, the Campbell's soup cans and the Maryland diptych, became icons for the aging of the avant-garde and its displacement by an ironic sensibility that playfully transgressed the lines between art and commerce, zealously embracing both the fetishism of commodities and the no less decisive fetishism of persons. It should hardly surprise us that in this climate, Adorno's attempt to sustain the modernist ideal of autonomous art against the ravages of the culture industry could strike some readers as hopelessly antiquated. For younger readers in the 1970s who longed for a more engagé mode of aesthetic expression, it was not uncommon to declare that not only Adorno, but the broader tradition of the Frankfurt School critical theory had capitulated to tradition, and that the appeal to high modernism was a further sign of its obsolescence. The strong verdict against Adorno for his apparent retreat into a depoliticized experience of auratic art was a commonplace theme, even among sympathetic readers such as Sheila Beneby, who wrote that in Adorno's thought, the emancipatory hopes that had once been found in human action were, quote, transposed into the aesthetic realm, but were left there to languish with their promise unfulfilled. For such readers, the imperatives of effective political praxis must assume precedence, and any concern for aesthetics takes on the conservative stigma of political helplessness that Walter Benjamin himself had once diagnosed as left-wing melancholy. In this third and final lecture, I wish to offer at least a partial defense of Adorno against this negative reception. Aesthetics for Adorno does not mean aestheticism. He looks to art as a preserve of critical consciousness and as a sign of freedom in an unfree world. For this reason, no discussion of the sources of normativity in his work can be adequate if it does not somehow take into consideration the normative power that inheres in the aesthetic. Here we must address the simple fact that is too easily overlooked by those who would regard Adorno primarily or exclusively as a social theorist or social philosopher. In the official Zollkamp edition of Adorno's collected works, the volumes that address primarily aesthetic themes, both musicological and literary, comprise a full half of the published corpus. At issue here, of course, is not the sheer number of pages that are devoted to any particular domain, but the significance of this domain for the author's general aim. My argument is that the aesthetic for Adorno is not peripheral. It is of central relevance for the way in which he conceives of normativity. If we shut our eyes to the luminous glow of the aesthetic, we blind ourselves to what for Adorno was surely among the most enduring redoubts of normativity in the ever-darkening landscape of the late modern age. Of course, Adorno was hardly sanguine about the chances for art to survive over the long term. And at least in this respect, he invites the verdict of left-wing melancholy, as if he can see no better option than to document the process of cultural decline. If we recall Freud's distinction between mourning and melancholia, it may appear as if Adorno's attachment to the decayed remnants of late modernism are symptoms of a pathology, an inability to mourn, or a refusal to undo his cathexis with the artworks of the past, so as to return to the aesthetic and political demands of the present. Even if this verdict seems unkind, we can't deny that when Adorno considered the aesthetic possibilities of the future, he feared the worst. In the aesthetic theory, we're told that it is thinkable and not merely an abstract possibility that great music was possible only during a limited phase of humanity. For Adorno, the historical emergence of art was conditional upon the social ascent of the bourgeoisie and its institutional and ideological emancipation from feudal authorities. What Adorno called autonomous art became a real possibility only at a rather late date in modern history, with the unbinding of aesthetic experience from its sacral origins. But if autonomous art appeared in concert with social rationalization, then the very processes that made it possible also threatened its survival. The birth of art was also the beginning of its death. Here we're confronted with a phenomenon that we might call a dialectic of aesthetic secularization. With the gradual reification of consciousness by the culture industry and what Adorno called the withering of experience in the increasingly rationalized society around him, Adorno expressed his genuine fear that art may have entered the age of its demise. For Adorno, art was evanescent, but also essential. Without the promise that beckoned from the aesthetic, it's difficult to imagine that Adorno could have sustained any hope at all for the redemption of humanity. To pursue this argument in depth, we must look again not only at the philosophical claims about art that Adorno develops in his aesthetic theory, but also at the substantive efforts in aesthetic analysis, and especially musicological analysis, that occupy such a large share of his oeuvre. I would further suggest that any attempt to honor what may still be of value in Adorno's reflections on aesthetics must retain not only the argumentative but also the experiential dimension. It is in fact a central claim in Adorno's aesthetics that theory must remain in an intimate, if dialectical, proximity to the art it strives to understand. In the draft introduction to the aesthetic theory, Adorno wrote that aesthetics could be productive only if it combined critical distance from the empirical with a, quote, closeness bordering on embodiment. Leibhaft now. It must be possible to judge the work both from the outside and also, Adorno wrote, from within, so as to seize upon what he calls the work's experiential force. Andrängende Erfahrung. What is redemptive to art must admit of discursive analysis, he admits, but it is only accessible if our conceptual efforts do not dominate and obscure the sensuous particularity of aesthetic experience itself. Of course, for a rationalized consciousness that suffers from an atrophied capacity for experience of any kind, the sensuous particularity of aesthetic experience that Adorno demands is increasingly rare. This is why Adorno expressed such loathing at the bourgeois category of free time. When aesthetic experience is banished to a discrete domain of leisure, this only confirms the impoverishment of our own sensuous being. The nature within human nature has become, for Adorno, an endangered species that survives like a zoological specimen that is known only as a type and not in its particularity. This emphasis on the priority of the object in aesthetics is the materialist theme in Adorno's philosophical writing. But it is also an attempt to preserve within concepts a reference to that which exceeds concepts. If art enjoys an elevated prestige for Adorno, this is because he sees it as a preserve for the non-conceptual and mimetic moment in human experience that elsewhere in society is verging on extinction. In the winter semester 1958-59 lectures on aesthetics, Adorno observes that with the increasing domination of nature, the experience of nature's overwhelming power has grown dim, but is not yet wholly extinguished. Nature shows itself in the artwork as the objective material that somehow resists domination. Ever since Kant, we have known that aesthetic experience is dialectical. It combines the feeling of self-control with the experience of being overwhelmed. Even in modern art, this dialectic remains instructive. Adorno borrows from a phrase from Horace to say that nature cannot be driven out from artistic beauty even with a pitchfork. The mimetic in art is a reminder of a relationship of non-domination between subject and world, between human and nature. Aesthetics honors this mimetic relationship when it fastens our attention on the artwork in all of its sensuous particularity without dissolving its specificity into a mere network of concepts. This may help to explain why the very notion of an aesthetic theory for Adorno is riddled with ambivalence. On the one hand, he's not embarrassed to state with apodictic certitude that the truth content of an artwork requires philosophy. The truth content of an artwork requires philosophy. No artwork, in his view, remains self-identical or purely what it is, as if it were a timeless truth. Artworks become what they are, he claims, because they summon forth forms of spirit through the process of commentary and critique. On the other hand, he hastens to claim that aesthetic thought cannot succeed if it remains external to specific works of art. So long as the work is not entered, Adorno writes with reference to Goethe, as a chapel would be entered, all talk about objectivity in matters of aesthetics remains pure assertion. Any genuine theory of aesthetics that does not collapse back into sterile theoreticism, if it is not to collapse back into sterile theoreticism, has to emerge from the labor of immanent criticism and from an actual encounter with the art object in all of its material specificity. These preliminary reflections now leave us in a better position to grasp the normative significance that Adorno assigns to the aesthetic. I'll focus specifically on music, not only because this is the aesthetic medium with which I'm most familiar, but also because it is the medium that lies at the center of Adorno's own thinking and best illustrates his claims. Without great exaggeration, it could even be said that for Adorno, music enjoyed a paradigmatic status, not only among the arts, but as a formal model for philosophy itself. The point is immediately evident if we consult the notes and fragments that Adorno left behind for his study of Beethoven. We owe an enormous debt to Adorno's student, the recently deceased Wolf Tiedemann, for editing these notes and making them available for readers in a legible form. The notes, written as early as 1938 and as late as 1966, show that Beethoven's music figured as a constant preoccupation for Adorno across nearly all phases of his adult life, from the lonely years in Oxford through the period of exile in New York and then Los Angeles, and then back to Frankfurt from 1949 to his death. In Beethoven's music, Adorno heard not only a correlative to the Hegelian dialectic, but in fact an internal critique of the dialectic. Beethoven's music, he writes, is Hegelian philosophy, but at the same time it is truer than that philosophy. This is so, Adorno explains, because Beethoven grasps what Hegel does not, that the self-identity of society is false. This is especially so in the works of the late Beethoven that embody what Adorno characterized as Spätstil, or late style. Consider, for example, Adorno's remarks from the unpublished 1939 text, Toward a Theory of Beethoven. The key to the very late Beethoven, he writes, lies in the fact that in this music, the idea of totality as something already achieved has become unbearable. Now, in the better-known 1937 essay on Beethoven's late style, Adorno characterizes this critique of totality as a breaking free from the power of the subject. This should be contrasted to the well-known heroic style of Beethoven's middle period, when all elements are unified and subjective will is expressed in thematic materials that unfold with dialectical necessity from struggle to triumph. Late works, however, Adorno argues, are no longer harmonious forms. Their surface is not smooth, but riven by tears and fissures, that are left behind by an artist who no longer strives for total mastery of his material. Here, the metaphorical language anticipates the famous conclusion to Minima Moralia, where we are told that philosophy must adopt a perspective on the world that will reveal its rifts and crevices. In such remarks, we can see Adorno groping toward the critique of idealist totalization that would come to fruition in negative dialectics. The striking thing, however, is that late style becomes something more than a mere illustration. It becomes the phenomenological model for what philosophy itself should do. In a fragment from 1953, Adorno compresses this discovery into a bold aphorism. One can no longer compose like Beethoven, he writes, but one must think as he composed. The question I'd like to address here is just what Adorno could have possibly meant by this. The perplexity is considerable, not least because he describes late works in strongly negative terms. With their sudden discontinuities, they are works that resist any harmonious synthesis or secure middle ground. In the history of art, Adorno concludes, late works are the catastrophes. Such claims may tempt us to say that Beethoven's late style finds its philosophical analog in Adorno's negativism, where aesthetic experience no longer provides any glimpse of the good, but can only offer images of what is bad. Here, then, it may seem as if we found further confirmation for the reading of Adorno as an epistemic negativist. This conclusion, however, runs into difficulties once we look more closely at how Adorno actually listens to music and what lessons he hears, even in the catastrophes of Beethoven's late style. My argument here is that when we consult his musicological writings, we're compelled to modify the view of Adorno as an epistemic negativist. Instead, we must take seriously the dialectic in the aesthetic domain that points, however faintly, to a happiness beyond catastrophe. To grasp the fuller meaning of this claim, it would be helpful to follow Adorno into the details of musicological commentary. Perhaps the most obvious point of entry, especially for those who may not be schooled in music, is the remark from the aesthetic theory on Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 in D minor, Opus 125, where we're asked to consider the experience that is aroused in the first movement at the halfway point where the dominant theme makes its famous reprise. As the timpanis start to roll, the strings return to their opening gesture, the fortissimo statement of a falling fifth from dominant to tonic, then a falling fourth from tonic to the lower dominant, then falling once more to the tonic below. Each jagged statement now sounds so decisive, it seizes the auditor as a verdict without appeal, and it assumes greater force as the theme quits its tonal home and tilts upward, modulating momentarily into the subdominant. For Adorno, the effect of this reprisal on the listener is a kind of shock, the feeling of Erschütterung, or being shaken. It is, he writes, a moment in which the recipient forgets himself and disappears into the work. The recipient loses his footing, and the possibility of truth that is embodied in the aesthetic image becomes tangible. This experience is something beyond subjective Erlebnis, beyond merely subjective experience. Adorno calls it the eruption of objectivity into subjective consciousness. Here Adorno tries to capture in almost phenomenological terms what he means by the priority of the object. The musical experience of Erschütterung challenges the subject nearly to the point of annihilation. The thematic reprisal, he writes, serves as a memento for the liquidation of the I, in which, being shaken, it becomes aware of its own limitedness and finitude. Crucial here is the fact that Adorno does not characterize this experience in wholly negative terms. For a few moments, Adorno writes, the I becomes aware in real terms of the possibility of letting self-preservation fall away. even though, of course, the experience is confined to the realm of musical semblance, and the I does not actually succeed in realizing that emancipation. But in the reprisal, the I, Adorno says, can catch a glimpse beyond the prison that is its own armored self. Recall my summary of Fidelio from the first lecture. I should mention in passing here that Adorno's interpretation stands in stark contrast to a very famous feminist interpretation of this same moment in the reprisal by the musicologist Susan McClary, who describes exactly this moment in the reprisal as, quote, one of the most horrifyingly violent episodes in the history of music. For McClary, this passage thematizes not the finitude of the self, but instead the identification of pleasure with what she calls thrusting desire and murderous rage. She actually equates it to a sexual assault. Although I don't wish to invalidate McClary's interpretation, it strikes me as noteworthy that she assumes an unproblematic identity between the thematic subject and the experiential subject. Adorno challenges that identity, which may explain why he's more attuned to the possibility that the experiential subject, that is us, feels shaken rather than confirmed by the overwhelming force that emanates from the musical theme. If we were to take on board the feminist presuppositions that animate McClary's reading, we might conclude that the music does not actually validate, but calls into question the patriarchal authority of the musical recipient. Late style, then, might be defined as an aesthetic that breaks from the confinement of established forms. On this point, Adorno sustained a remarkable consistency throughout his career. In a 1966 address on the Norddeutsche Rundfunk, he returned to the question of late style, and he offered remarks on the string quartet number 13 in B-flat major, that is Opus 130. He concludes with comments on the fifth movement, the cavatina, a lovely and lilting slow movement in E-flat major that comes with the directive Adagio molto espressivo. The written text from the 1966 radio address tells us that Adorno concluded with a recording. He ended his lecture with a recording with a brief excerpt from the cavatina, bars 23 to 30. So I'll note in passing that the cavatina ranks among the composer's own most favored compositions. In a conversation with Karl Holz, the second violinist in the Schuppanzig Quartet, Beethoven said that the cavatina was composed in the very tears of misery, and that never had one of his own pieces moved him so deeply. Not all auditors have responded so favorably to the movement. Stravinsky once called the cavatina pedestrian, a term he also applied indiscriminately to all of Beethoven's late quartets. And there you have it, the kernel of Adorno's dislike of Stravinsky. More typical, however, is the observation shared by Charles Rosen, who wrote of the emotions expressed in the cavatina that they are so intimate it hardly seems right to be allowed to witness them. The association with private emotion may strike us as rather ironic, since, as some of you may know, in 1977, the cavatina gained not only public but genuinely cosmic fame when it was sent aboard the Voyager spacecrafts as the final musical selection on the so-called Golden Record. So there are extraterrestrials somewhere out there swooning to that movement. Adorno, of course, knew nothing of this later fame, but his own interpretation of the cavatina puts an unusual spin on the view that it is a document of subjective feeling. Adorno hears the cavatina not as subjective expression, but as a document of the subject's loss of power. This is why in his radio address, Adorno assigns the cavatina an exemplary role in what he calls the process of mythologization. In Beethoven's late works, Adorno says, the myth of self-aggrandizing subjectivity yields to a diversity of materials that no longer bend to the composer's will. The dying hand, Adorno writes, released what it had previously clutched fast, shaped and controlled, so that what is released becomes its higher truth. And this attenuation of the subject is what Adorno calls, quite importantly, an expression of hope. This allusion to hope should arouse our interest because it marks the significance of late style for the question of normativity. If Adorno regards late style as an expression of hope, it's because it points beyond the narrow confines of modern experience as defined by instrumental reason. And I'll expand on that point momentarily. But first, I feel it's necessary to note that Adorno did not reserve the term late only for the last phase of Beethoven's compositions. The characteristic features of late style were elevated into criteria with a general validity across all differences of history. This is a very controversial point, and it may strike us as paradoxical insofar as we commonly think of Adorno as an historicist, not only in his social philosophy, but in his aesthetics. If for Hegel, philosophy as its own age comprehended in thought, we're tempted to say that for Adorno, a great work of art would also be its own age comprehended in the particularity of its sensuous material. Much to our surprise, however, Adorno rejects that historicist principle as a criterion of aesthetic success. Late style becomes in his writing not just one style among many, but rather the style that resists style. This is because for Adorno, the moment of hope in a work of art is the moment that permits us a glimpse beyond conformity. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, we're told, for example, that the great artists were never those whose works embodied style in its least fraction. This was true already, Adorno says, in the classical style of Mozart, whose works, quote, contain objective tendencies which resist the style they incarnate. And it remained true, he continues, up to Schoenberg and Picasso, since great artists have always been mistrustful of style. Now, if we understand him correctly here, Adorno means to say that the very notion of style implies a kind of schematism that imposes not only intelligibility, but unity and uniformity on the experiential manifold. But such regularity corresponds to social conformity, since it would mean that nothing could show itself within the bounds of our experience that did not affirm the eternal repetition of the same. If a work of art is to serve as an expression of hope, it must transgress this mythic repetition and rescind from the rules that are embodied both in the artwork and in society. This is why late style becomes for Adorno a generalized category of aesthetic appraisal, even if the specific modalities of aesthetic transgression change over time. That's a very controversial claim, and I'm going to back it up. Even in the pages of the aesthetic theory, although the book is typically seen as confining its discussion to high modernism, Adorno doesn't hesitate to speak of late style as a characteristic shared by artists as diverse as Michelangelo and Rembrandt. Those who wish to read Adorno only as a theorist of modernism often neglect to note that late style is not merely the name for what he calls an alleged historical temperament. Its validity, he says, obtains far beyond any individual oeuvre. Rather, he declares it has exemplary force. Among all of Adorno's musicological monographs, it's perhaps the 1960 study of Mahler that best illustrates the status of late style as the privileged aesthetic of the entire bourgeois era. Brokenness, Adorno writes there, lay at the experiential core of Mahler's music. It's perhaps too easy to accuse Mahler of neo-romanticism, especially when he permits himself mimetic allusions to nature. The composer originally intended to give the movements of the Third Symphony programmatic titles. The second movement, for example, carries the name, "What the Flowers in the Meadow Tell Me." And the third movement has the name, "What the Animals of the Forest Tell Me." The prominence of such creaturely symbolism in Mahler bespeaks both a longing to return to nature and the melancholy awareness that the way back to paradise is blocked. Through animals, Adorno writes, humanity becomes aware of itself as impeded nature. Mahler, he says, constantly expresses the yearning for a breakthrough from the course of the world, but then acknowledges that the breakthrough has been thwarted. The characteristic gestures in Mahler's music are directed against domination and signal his alliance with those who are dismissed to the margins of society. His thematic materials are gathered up like discarded remnants, the shabby residue that, Adorno says, accuses the triumphant. But this aesthetic of what is broken or marginal also means that Mahler turns his music into the voice of nature. The music, Adorno writes, comports itself like animals and confers utterance on the speechless by imitating their ways in sound. For Mahler, as in Kafka's fables, Adorno writes, the animal realm is the human world as it would appear from the standpoint of redemption. All of these reflections suggest that Adorno hears in Mahler not only a lamentation, but also a half-broken hope. Only those who are wholly unfree for Mahler embody freedom. By aligning itself with what has been excluded, Mahler's music carries the promise of inclusion and a happiness that remains, for the most part, unrealized. Now, when we encounter such claims in Adorno's musical writing, it may be tempting to dismiss them as exercises in projection. Too frequently, it seems, Adorno hears in the music he most loves the very same aesthetic of brokenness, as if his preferred canon were a compulsive repetition of the same forms. Such criticism would be misguided, I think, because we need to read Adorno's musicological writing alongside his philosophical work as exercises in immanent critique. If he seeks out the promissory elements in music, this is because he cleaves so passionately to the thought that all art, or all successful art, is successful only insofar as it remains faithful to its role as a promesse du bonheur. Promesse du bonheur. This promise and the enduring significance of late style becomes most evident, of course, in Adorno's discussion of the 20th century avant-garde, and especially in his writing on the Second Viennese School. In the 1949 Philosophy of New Music, Adorno aligns himself with Schoenberg and against Stravinsky in terms that often descend into mere polemic. Schoenberg, at least in his earlier compositions, appears in Adorno's book as the agent of aesthetic progress, Stravinsky as an impresario for all that is archaic and irrational. Adorno goes so far as to suggest a resemblance between Stravinsky's musical primitivism and the fetish of origins that animates phenomenology. Both capitulate to the merely given and long for a restoration of authentic being. It's not by accident that the score to Stravinsky's ballet that scandalized Parisian audiences in 1913 portrays a ritual sacrifice. According to Adorno, the music betrays the humanistic impulses of art insofar as it identifies not with the victim, but with the annihilating authority. Schoenberg's music, by contrast, is genuinely revolutionary, Adorno says, not least because it refuses to affirm the positivity of the world in its present condition. Schoenberg's music, he says, repudiates the claim that the universal and the particular are reconciled. Schoenberg records in his music the real suffering of human history on the level of form. This is true, however, only when Schoenberg sustains his bond with expressionism. The mature system of 12-tone composition is vulnerable to decay. As a mechanical procedure, it becomes, Adorno says, quote, an objective image of repressive society. Music can only survive, he goes on, if the 12-tone technique that is absorbed into what Adorno calls free composition. Now, it's well known that Schoenberg himself did not welcome such criticism, and he even confided in a letter to an acquaintance that notwithstanding his personal dislike for Stravinsky's music, he saw little legitimacy in Adorno's philosophical polemics. I'll not dwell here on the debate as to whether Adorno's specific remarks on the contest between Schoenberg and Stravinsky have any merit. I'm interested only in the question as to how Adorno reads modern music as a preserve of normativity, and whether this normative dimension is understood best only in negativistic terms. To cast further light on this question, we can derive some profit from Adorno's 1957 Königstein lecture on the criteria of new music. Because this lecture has a programmatic intent. As the title suggests, it offers actual criteria in the normative sense for an appraisal of what Adorno termed success in music. That he ascribes some importance to this lecture is evident from the fact that he recommends it to students in his 1958 lecture on aesthetics as a model for his overall method of philosophical interpretation. In the Königstein lecture, Adorno suggests that aesthetic success in the modern age introduces a certain modification into the forms of aesthetic judgment that Kant first formulated in the third critique. In his discussion of the dynamical sublime, Kant meditated on the feelings that are aroused when we're confronted with experiences of nature that threaten to overpower us. Kant offers the following famous list: bold, overhanging, and threatening rocks, thunderclouds piled up to the vault of heaven, borne along with flashes and peals, volcanoes in all their violence of destruction, hurricanes leaving desolation in their track, the boundless ocean rising with rebellious force, the high waterfall of some mighty river, and so forth. According to Kant, such experiences leave us with a sense of our own power of resistance that can be no match for nature's power. But then he goes on to say that the sight of such natural power is only attractive so long as we find ourselves in a position of safety. We gladly call these objects sublime, Kant writes, because they elevate the strength of our soul above its usual level and allow us to discover within ourselves a capacity for resistance of quite another kind, which gives us the courage to measure ourselves against the apparent all-powerfulness of nature. Against nature's power, Kant continues, we discover in our own mind a superiority over nature itself. The irresistibility of nature's power, in other words, makes us recognize our own physical powerlessness, but also reveals a capacity for judging ourselves as independent of it. Our judgment of nature as sublime thus awakens a feeling of, Kant says, our superiority over nature, on which is grounded a self-preservation of quite another kind. And that sense of superiority consists in our recognition that even while the human being must submit outwardly to nature's dominion, the humanity in our person remains undiminished. Nearly 2 centuries later, Adorno mines this passage for its contemporary relevance. His interpretation, as I'll explain, brings us into the heart of his reflections on the normative power of aesthetic experience. In the late modern era, he says, Kant's observations on the dynamical sublime retain only a partial validity, and they've shifted the terrain of their application from nature to art. This historical shift in the status of the sublime is due to the historical process of a one-sided rationalization. The human world has now hardened into a second nature, and society itself has become the site of catastrophe. The natural terror of the Lisbon earthquake has been realized and outstripped by the purely human terror of Auschwitz. This transition from natural to social disaster has also transformed the experience of the sublime. If Kant could still trust in the sovereignty of human spirit, the 20th century, Adorno says, has robbed us of that confidence. Our happiness has now receded almost to a vanishing point. We speak of what is terrible without any belief in the security of absolutes, or in Adorno's words, without any illusory trust in, quote, spirits standing its ground. This means that the modern sense of terror is no longer a merely subjective feeling of the sublime, of a self who remains confident of its distance from what it observes. The terror instead has now become objective. Now, according to Adorno, this transformation has deep implications for our understanding of art. If nature has been displaced by society as second nature, then we can no longer hope to stand at any secure remove from what arouses our feelings of terror. Now, all of these considerations would seem to underwrite the commonplace reading of Adorno as a partisan of uncompromising austerity in art. His great admiration for Samuel Beckett, to whom he meant to dedicate the aesthetic theory, can serve as further support for the view that modern art, in Adorno's opinion, must become as dark as modern society itself. To survive reality at its most extreme, he wrote, artworks that do not want to sell themselves as consolation must equate themselves with reality. End quote. But a reality that verges on catastrophe would then seem to leave art with few options than to assume a catastrophe in their very form. And this is why he equates radical art with the color black. A similar argument leads Adorno to declare that the works of the Second Viennese School are superior because they embrace dissonance without apology and deny themselves the inherited conventions of consonance. It's this prohibition that gives the sounds of dissonance their critical power. Their negativity, Adorno says, remains loyal to utopia. So, such claims may again lend credence to the view of Adorno as a thoroughgoing negativist who believes that nothing in modern experience and nothing in aesthetic experience offers us even the slightest glimpse of a good beyond a presently bad world. I want to suggest, however, that this commonplace reading is not entirely correct, as it disregards a crucial insight that runs through all of Adorno's work. In the previous lecture, I quoted from the conclusion of Negative Dialectics, where Adorno says that our current existence is shot through with promises of happiness. He acknowledges that these promises are by no means satisfactory. Every happiness is but a fragment of the total happiness that humanity is now denied. More importantly, however, no instance of happiness can be found that is not itself in some way distorted by the general unhappiness of the social whole. The happiness that is known to us is therefore not an image of unblemished perfection or a regulative ideal in the Kantian sense. It is a happiness that is disfigured and incomplete. But Adorno does not deny that it is a happiness nonetheless. Were he to deny even this infinitesimal possibility, he would not be able to explain what it is in aesthetic experience that still beckons as a source of normative authority. But it's clear that for Adorno, something in our aesthetic experience still has the potential to exercise this authority, no matter how diminished it may be, in an age that is corrupted to its very core by the commodified and typified experiences that are generated for us by the culture industry. To explain this potential, however, we can't examine aesthetic experience in isolation from the deeper commitments of Adorno's philosophy. If we were to treat aesthetics as a wholly separate domain with its own categorical principles, we would fall into the error of reading Adorno as we might read Max Weber. We would reify distinctions of disciplinary expertise into differences of natural kinds, and we would lose sight of the fact that for Adorno, aesthetic considerations, alongside considerations of morality, sociology, politics, epistemology, and metaphysics, all belong to the fractured totality of our social experience as human beings. What the negativist reading misses, I would suggest, is the crucial insight that if aesthetic experience retains any meaning for us at all, it's only because at the deepest level it still reflects the mimetic capacity that inheres in our sensuous nature. This nature is, of course, distorted, but it is not entirely distinguished, and it's only in virtue of this capacity that we remain responsive to art at all. In the Kranichstein lecture on criteria of new music, Adorno speaks to the phenomenon of mimesis and its relevance for contemporary aesthetic experience. Now, the mimetic capacity is something truly enigmatic. Adorno calls it a reflex-like imitation of the nature that surrounds us. It is this capacity, he says, that permits spirit to gain separation from nature without domination. Such a separation can only be partial, since human nature cannot fully consummate its withdrawal from nature without separating itself from its own natural being. But this separation is also necessary insofar as human spirit itself arises as something, he says, other than existing reality. What Adorno seems to mean here is that mimesis is the original birthplace of our special capacity to take up a stance of second-order reflection on sensual conditions as they're given. Mimesis is therefore itself a mode of critical rationality within nature, but prior to the reification that set in once reason tried to effect a complete break from nature. Mimesis, we might say, is nature's capacity to gain some reflective distance upon itself. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Adorno's understanding of mimesis bears a certain debt to Benjamin's definition of mimesis and its survival in language as non-sensuous resemblance. Adorno capitalizes on this insight when he defines art as a modern refuge for this mimetic capacity. At the end of the bourgeois epoch, he tells us in the Kranichstein lecture, spirit recalls the mimesis of prehistoric times. As the world of things has grown ever more overwhelming in its sheer facticity and commands our uncritical assent, spirit, he admits, has gone into retreat. It has been compelled to hide itself in what he calls the rudimentary minimum of an aesthetic experience that still retains some traces of the mimetic capacity that is elsewhere marginalized or repressed. Art, Adorno tells us, bears witness to this otherwise suppressed mimesis. Autonomous art is an instance of our capacity for reflection on our own natural being. Even as it thematizes the separation between spirit and nature, it also thematizes their ongoing connection. It is this dialectic, the simultaneous separation and connection between nature and spirit, that makes aesthetic experience an occasion for what Adorno calls a precarious happiness. And that's what he thinks is going on. When you look at a work of art, you are experiencing the survival of mimesis, and that's the sense of sensual pleasure that you gain in any work of art. Now, any work of art. The affirmation of happiness may strike us as difficult to reconcile with Adorno's admiration for the avant-garde, and especially for the composers of the Second Viennese School, whom he elevated into the highest seats in the modernist pantheon. Especially challenging is the question of how we should understand the role of dissonance. In the aesthetic theory, we're told that the unresolved antagonisms of reality return in artworks as immanent problems of form. That's the programmatic dictum of the text, really. Artworks that are truthful as manifestations of a false society will exhibit in their very form certain characteristics that speak to the irresolution in society beyond them. This basic principle explains Adorno's admiration for the dissonant works of musical modernism, especially those works associated with Schoenberg and his school. The revolution in musical aesthetics that Schoenberg termed the emancipation of dissonance becomes for Adorno a sign of music's capacity for critique. Just as society has found no genuine resolution as yet, so too the works of free atonality abjure all resolution. But this preference for unresolved dissonance does not mean that music becomes the site of total negativity. In his Königstein lecture, Adorno hastens to explain that in the new music we can hear as much precarious happiness as despair. He goes so far as to insist that even the most cutting dissonance can also be beautiful. He reminds us that Alban Berg once expressed a yearning, quote, one day to hear a chord consisting of 8 different notes on 8 brass instruments playing fortissimo. Such a desire speaks to the mimetic impulse that remains alive not only in music but in rare moments of childhood bliss. Among the most powerful aesthetic impulses, Adorno says in the lecture, is what a child feels when he leaves a footprint in freshly fallen snow. For Adorno, such a somatic experience of happiness, with its mimetic and sensuous contact with natural phenomena, is not unrelated to the happiness of the musical avant-garde. The composer of advanced music does not make music into a mere seismograph of social irrationality, because the critique of irrationality must also sustain some grasp of the beauty that lies on the far side of our present condition. The modern composer becomes a critic of the so-called intact world when he, quote, commits himself to this beauty without reservation. Now, this happiness, of course, is partial and distorted and is clearly of the same order as the fragmentary happiness of metaphysical experience that appears at the conclusion to negative dialectics. To characterize such happiness as precarious does not imply that it is illusory or merely an instance of ideological consolation that we must dispel if we wish to confront the reality of social despair. Adorno, in other words, is not a totalizing negativist who denies the possibility of any and all light in our darkening world. As I noted at the beginning of the first lecture, he's committed to immanent critique, and this means he's alive to the promises of happiness that show themselves in immanent experience, like the sunlight in Fidelio, that shows itself not beyond the prison walls, but between the bars in the prison itself. The precarity of happiness implies its compromised status within the confines of a bad society that prevents us from enjoying an unobstructed view of the good. This may explain why we're told in the aesthetic theory that not just some art, but all art is, quote, endowed with sadness. It conveys a melancholy sigh, Adorno writes, oh, if only it were so, that interlaces a longing for possibility with the grim knowledge that this longing remains unfulfilled. So, coming to the conclusion. My remarks in this lecture today are meant to motivate a far more global claim regarding the sources of normativity in Adorno's work. The problem of normativity cannot be understood if we attempt to isolate only one dimension of his thought according to the received conventions of academic inquiry. Over the course of his life, Adorno never took up a permanent resonance in any single academic discipline. He contributed to sociology as well as musicology, philosophy as well as literary criticism. But toward all of these disciplines, he assumed the posture of an exile or a migrant who had made the experience of wandering into an essential motif for his thought. Today, he once observed, it is part of morality not to be at home in one's home. This desideratum has an especially powerful meaning today when we are confronted with a crisis of migration that has awakened xenophobic responses and renewed nativism that insists on the exclusive rights of the native against the foreign-born. But the claim also applies to our interpretation of Adorno's own work. To speak of his aesthetics or his practical philosophy as a separable domain may send us down a false path where we imagine his thought as conforming to the customary distinctions that now predominate in the modern university. The fact of the matter is that Adorno had scant respect for these distinctions, and he developed his thinking in a spirit of freedom that willfully denied their authority. Early in his life, Adorno was confronted with the demand that he make a painful choice between careers. In a 1926 letter, Alban Berg sought to assure Adorno of his musical talents, but also warned him that he could not pursue both music and philosophy. "I've become absolutely convinced," Berg wrote, "that you are qualified to achieve the highest by way of profound insight into music, and will do so through major philosophical works. But," he said in conclusion, "you will one day have to choose, Kant or Beethoven." Now, Adorno held Berg in the highest esteem, but he refused to accept the suggestion that such a choice was necessary. More than 20 years later, in a 1948 letter to Thomas Mann, Adorno wrote, "I studied philosophy and music. Instead of deciding exclusively for one subject or the other, I have always had the feeling that my real vocation was to pursue one and the same thing in both of these different realms." For Adorno, the central questions of aesthetics, therefore, could not be divorced from the questions of human purpose that animate critical thinking across all boundaries of disciplinary specialization. His commitment to the so-called autonomy of art does not contradict this holistic principle. Art, for him, is both social and antisocial. It is only through its withdrawal into the immanent laws of its own form that art can also be responsible, can also sustain a critical function toward its own social conditions. But the emphasis on criticism should not tempt us into losing sight of the deeper normative promise that inheres in aesthetic experience. And it's at this point, I think, that we can mark the reprisal of the materialist motif concerning the primacy of the object that I mentioned in my first lecture. Adorno cleaves with passion to the survival of art because he finds in it the promise of a material happiness that society denies. Despite all the distortions of the human being, we have a capacity to respond in art to an experience of beauty that used to be given to us in the unmediated experience of nature. Natural beauty, Adorno tells us, is given to us through a sensual receptivity beyond all domination. It points to the primacy of the object in subjective experience. But Adorno does not think that nature in itself still persists with the independence it would need to sustain this responsiveness. If this power has withered in most precincts of life, it still survives in art, like a final bequest from a metaphysical tradition that has long since fallen into ruin. In the winter semester 1957-58 course on aesthetics, we're told that, quote, "Art is an attempt to do justice to all that falls victim to the ongoing concept of control over nature." So art is a preserve of our mimetic experience of a nature beyond domination. If the dialectic of enlightenment is an ongoing process of increased domination that distances us both from one another and from the non-human environment, then art, he says, has the task of revoking this process. Art, Adorno claims, is the memory of the suppressed, and the memory of all those internal powers which are destroyed by the process of progressive human rationalization. It's true, of course, that art remains itself caught in the realm of semblance. It can't overcome its mediated relation to sensuous nature. Adorno is not blind to the fact that an artwork alone cannot achieve what it promises. He doesn't repeat the utopian fantasy articulated by Schiller that humanity could find its ultimate fulfillment in aesthetic play alone. But he insists that from within semblance, it points beyond semblance to genuine peace. And this is what Adorno means when he writes that the artwork, quote, anticipates reconciliation. This is also why Adorno entertains the thought that a world without suffering would no longer need art. Aesthetic happiness would vanish if its illusory promise were made at last real. The normative significance of art, then, resides in its anticipatory power. But I've insisted throughout these 3 lectures on the point that Adorno remained alive to anticipatory promises of happiness, not only in works of art, but also in the marginal occurrences of singular force that he characterized as metaphysical experience. Memories of childhood, or even somatic moments of extraordinary happiness that break through the walls of the bourgeois ego, became for Adorno the dispersed fragments of a total happiness that modern society denies. And all of these are what he called exercises for the right life. Only the exercise of immanent criticism can break open the normative secret hidden in such moments and use them as critical leverage against current suffering. This promise is normative not because it holds out an image of the perfect and undistorted good, but it's also more than a mere negation of current conditions. If Adorno were an advocate of totalizing negativity, then he could not make sense of the allusion to such marginal experiences as the imperfect moments of an unrealized whole. I noted in the second lecture that Adorno borrowed from Kant the principle that the summum bonum compels us to make room in our moral philosophy for the archaic promise of eternal life. Here too we see how Adorno invests his materialism with normative force. Mortal life becomes the theater for the realization of the maximalist promises that once belonged to religion. This is the meaning of his claim that dialectics must secularize the traditional mystical teaching that situated transcendence not in another worldly beyond, but only within inner worldliness itself. In the modern age, when metaphysical thoughts of eternity have become a scandal, the mystical affirmation of what is transient gets sublated into materialism. No meditation on transcendence is possible anymore, Adorno says, except by virtue of transience. Or, in other words, as I said in the last lecture, metaphysics must slip into materialism. And the very same sentiment reappears in the well-known dictum that I quoted before, that nothing of theological content will persist without being transformed. Every content will have to put itself to the test of migrating into the realm of the secular and the profane. The appeal to theology suggests that Adorno was not a thinker of Gnostic darkness, as he is occasionally made out to be by even his most discerning critics. On the contrary, and here I come to my most audacious claim, the most risky one, far from endorsing a minimal morality, his thinking actually confronts the world with a maximalist demand that religious tradition had once called messianic. It's only because this demand is so stringent and so impossible to meet that Adorno judges the world radically deficient. It serves as the counterfactual but necessary perfectionist standard against which all of our human striving must fall short. This is the real meaning, I think, of the messianic light, a hyperbolic phrase, to which Adorno refers at the conclusion to Minima Moralia. It speaks to the enduring force of a metaphysical impulse of perfectionism, even in a thinker who saw traditional metaphysics as no longer valid. As I bring these lectures to a close, I feel it's necessary to register my acute awareness that I've hardly succeeded in offering a philosophical argument as to how Adorno secures a final and incontestable grounding for his normative commitments. But I take some comfort in the fact that Adorno himself denied the possibility of any such grounding. Permit me, in closing, to recall once again the radio address with which I began these lectures from February 1969, when Adorno sought to defend himself against student activists who accused him of political resignation. His only defense was to insist on the intrinsic force of critical thinking. Stronger than any mode of merely strategic theory that already bends to instrumental application, he said, open thinking itself would already be a transformative practice. Adorno admitted that what he called the emphatic concept of thinking was not secured, not by existing conditions, nor by ends to be achieved, nor by any kind of battalions, that is, militant action. Now, this was the last essay to be published in his lifetime. And for this reason alone, perhaps it merits our attention as I close. What should intrigue us here is Adorno's resistance to the suggestion that our normative commitments find their ultimate justification in reason. To explain this point, I think we need to distinguish between sources and justifications. The sources of normativity would be the various phenomena that we experience as normative, as compelling us to a certain kind of response. Adorno identifies such phenomena with brute somatic pleasure, but also with higher modes of aesthetic pleasure, and with a whole range of mimetic experiences that exemplify our persisting responsiveness to nature. Such experiences are what Adorno characterizes in negative dialectics as the fragments of a total happiness that the world denies. He admits that such phenomena cannot furnish us with certain guides to normativity. Although they are given to us, as opposed to being constructs of deontological reasoning, they are hardly incorrigible, and they don't serve as evidence for an objective moral structure or a natural law that's built into the cosmos. Whatever guidance they may provide is precarious and uncertain. This precarity is chiefly due to what Adorno calls the withering of experience overall. The dialectic of social rationalization has compromised not only common frameworks of political freedom, it's also damaged the individual human subject, especially its capacity for responsiveness and warmth. The bourgeois self is gradually losing its psychological integrity and turning into a mere type that identifies with and submits to power. This new anthropological type is growing indifferent to experience and its normative claims. I've noted already that these claims are not incorrigible. We can't rely on them in the same way that an apodictic theory of normativity would demand. And this is why there is still some further room for the task of philosophical justification. Adorno thinks that philosophy could play a helpful role in clarifying the normative claims that such sources may have for us. But he sees justification as a second-order conceptual exercise that cannot on its own furnish guidelines for practical action. More often than not, Adorno appeals to philosophical argument only to break the authority of philosophical convention and to illuminate the sources of normativity that conventional ethics is liable to obscure. Running through Adorno's work is a pronounced suspicion regarding the task of philosophical justification. He fears that in appealing to concepts, we tend to lose sight of the sources that lie beyond the space of reason, in the non-identical realm of material experience. But this does not mean that he wishes to abandon justification entirely. He does not think that the sources speak for themselves, and he does not trust in what is given in experience without some work of interpretation. The sources of normativity do not appear to us with the full-dress prestige of rational justification. They are more like phenomenological models. They do not argue, but rather show. They show us, with all their fragility, other ways of being human. They do not justify, they exemplify, much as children's games exemplify the bare outlines of a right life in the midst of the false. One more page. But Adorno was keenly aware of the fact that most of us are rarely responsive to what such models reveal. In his aesthetic theory, he tells us that the truth of an artwork can only unfold in concert with interpretation, commentary, and critique. This principle holds not only for the artwork, but for all sources of normativity whose claims upon us have now grown so faint that we may not hear them without philosophical assistance. But Adorno placed little confidence in the power of philosophy to reawaken the primary experiences once they have lost their authority. Critical thinking, he tells us, has grown no less precarious than happiness itself. Whatever has once been thought, Adorno tells us, can be suppressed, can be forgotten, or can vanish altogether. All the same, Adorno remains confident that a certain normative commitment inheres in critical thinking itself. This normativity is grounded in something deeper than mere reason alone, and it reaches well beyond the satisfactions of the philosopher who attains to a kind of intellectual beatitude in the isolation of his study. If Adorno doubted that philosophy could furnish our normative commitments with justifications that are rational in structure, this is because he felt that reason in its current form had lost contact with the material experiences that animate human life and make this life worthwhile. What I called Adorno's materialism is the philosophical name for the attempt to restore this contact, to call philosophy back from its conceptual flights so that it can take instruction from the manifold and mimetic experiences that beckon to us from beyond the concept in the realm of the non-identical. Such emphatic thinking is not an invitation to irrationalism, though it is suspicious of seeking a rational justification for our normative commitments. It finds its highest warrant not in philosophy, but in an experience of universal happiness that belongs to the human species as its unrealized promise. The happiness that dawns in the eye of the thinking person, Adorno said, is the happiness of humanity. 50 years since his death, when the promise of a genuine happiness is so often betrayed, perhaps these words can stand as both his epitaph and an enduring testament to his memory. Stop at 8.
I wanted to give you the public the choice between two options, either to have 2 or 3 either trivial or more or less complex questions, or to leave the last lecture like it is, namely as a kind of theoretical artwork in itself. I'm very sorry to tell you that you don't have the first option. Because we have to stop at 8 o'clock straight. So I'm very sorry for this. No discussion. Leave this lecture like it was, and I think it's worthwhile to leave it like it was. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Let me just tell you, you can write me my Harvard address, and I'd be very grateful for any comments and criticism.
I would just like to thank the 2 people who helped organizing this event, and without them it wouldn't have been possible to have these wonderful Adorno lectures, namely Sidonia Flechter, Susanne Kappler, Nils Lehnhäuser, Pamela Fasano, Almus Popinga, Ela Rockers, Sarah Handelbaum und Ina Walter. Thank you very much.